I was standing barefoot on the front step when the door slammed behind me, the sound sharp enough to make the neighbors look up. Grant said it like he was reading a grocery list, calm and practiced. "She does not live here anymore." The county officer held her clipboard at chest level as if it were a ruler, and I were being measured for worth. And someone across the street lifted a phone because this is how things are remembered now. I was 23, and I had slept in that house the night before, but in that moment I was treated like a stranger who had wandered onto the wrong porch. My name is Noelle. I work part-time as a compliance assistant, the kind of job where you read rules people ignore and learn how silence can be weaponized. Grant is my stepfather, mid-40s, polite enough to sound reasonable while he does cruel things with a straight face. My mother, Denise, stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, not stepping out, choosing quiet the way some people choose shelter. The officer was Ms. Caldwell, late 50s county code enforcement, the kind of woman who can tell if a story is missing a page by the way a form is filled. Mrs. Haskins from next door hovered with concern that never crossed the sidewalk, a good neighbor with good eyesight and a ring camera that never blinks. Grant escalated quickly. He took my shoes and set them inside. He took my jacket and hung it back on the hook. He took my keys from the bowl and slid them into his pocket. He even kept my small zip pouch with my medication and told me I was grown and I would figure it out. Then he smiled and added, "Do not make a scene. Noelle, you always loved drama." It landed the way gaslighting always does, soft and sharp at the same time. Ms. Caldwell asked for identification and proof of residency. Grant supplied his voice again. "She is unstable. She comes and goes. We tried to help." My mother finally spoke, and the sentence sounded reasonable enough to be deadly. "Maybe it is time you learn responsibility." I reached into my wallet, and the old ID appeared by accident, caught behind a student card, a worn plastic rectangle I had carried for years without thinking. Ms. Caldwell stopped writing. She did not gasp or raise her voice. She simply paused, eyes still pen hovering, and then she looked at the ID again. That stillness was louder than shouting. I did not say anything. I did not need to. If I spoke too soon, they would cover it. I needed them to show more. If you saw your child pulled out of a home like this, would you step in, or would you tell yourself it was not your place? Before this story continues, please allow me to make one thing clear. The story you are about to hear is a work of fiction created for entertainment and educational purposes, to reflect toxic family conflicts and the inner journey of a woman who endured in silence for too long. All characters, events, and situations are entirely fictional and do not represent any real person or real event. The content may be supported by AI tools during the creative and production process. This story does not promote violence, hatred, or harm in any form. It is told to evoke empathy, reflection, and personal growth, especially for women who have sacrificed, endured, and been hurt within their own families. The entire narrative is designed to be advertiser-friendly and compliant with YouTube community guidelines and is not intended to defame, target, or imply any real individual. If you recognize a part of your own life in this story, stay until the end. And if your heart is moved, share your thoughts in the comments, or follow the channel to continue with stories for women who have borne unfair burdens, yet still deserve understanding and respect. The officer shifted her weight and began writing, and that was when fear set in for me in a way that shouting never could, because it meant my existence was being translated into boxes and lines that someone else would interpret later. Grant stood a half step behind her shoulder, close enough to guide the narrative without touching it, and said in a calm voice that sounded practiced, "She has been unstable lately, comes and goes. We have tried to help, but this is not working." The word unstable hung there like a diagnosis no one had earned. I opened my mouth to correct him and then closed it because I had learned that interruptions only give people like Grant more room to tighten the story around you. Ms. Caldwell did not look at me when she asked for my full name. She did not look at me when she asked for my date of birth. She wrote. The pen scratched. My mother stayed in the doorway with her arms folded. Not defensive, not protective, just contained as if keeping her body inside the house would keep the house intact. "Maybe it is time you learn responsibility," she said, her voice careful the way people sound when they think they are being reasonable. The words landed harder than Grant's accusation because they came wrapped in concern. Across the street, Mrs. Haskins leaned forward on her porch rail and whispered something to a woman who had stopped walking her dog. A phone chimed softly. Someone pressed a Ring doorbell across the way and then pretended they had not. Mrs. Caldwell asked me for proof of residency. The phrase was clean and official and terrifying. I said my name again. I said the house address. Grant laughed, once short and dismissive, and added, "She does not have mail here. She uses friends' addresses. She is young, you know how it is." The officer nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement the way people do when they have to collect every version before deciding which one to weigh. She asked me where I worked. I answered. She asked how long I had lived at the address. I answered. She asked if I had any documentation. I held up my wallet with hands that surprised me by not shaking. I could feel eyes on my bare feet on the fact that my jacket was still inside on the small pouch with my medication that Grant had set out of reach. It was astonishing how quickly a life could be reduced to visible omissions. Ms. Caldwell began filling a section at the top of the page, and I recognized the header without trying. County of Dauphin, Department of Codes and Housing Safety, Case Intake. I knew the spacing, I knew the font. I had seen that form on my desk more than once in a different building on quiet afternoons, when violations were sorted into categories and outcomes were decided by consistency. I watched her check a box that labeled me occupant status disputed and felt something settle in my chest, not panic, but clarity. This was how people disappear, not through force, but through documentation that says they do not belong. Grant leaned closer and lowered his voice as if sharing a concern. "She has been emotional," he said. "We did not want to do this, but you understand." Ms. Caldwell did not respond. She asked me for identification. I reached into my wallet and produced my student card first, then my state ID and placed them into her open hand. She took them and wrote more. My mother sighed as if exhausted by the process rather than the cause. "You cannot keep living like this, Noelle," she said. And for the first time she looked at me not with anger but with something worse, acceptance of the story that made her life easier. I realized then that my life had been narrated by other people for a long time, that my silence had been used as punctuation to end arguments I never agreed to. Ms. Caldwell asked me if I had any mail, any bills, any lease, anything that tied me to the address. Grant answered for me, "No, she does not. She never did." The officer held up a finger, not sharply, just enough to pause him, and looked at me directly for the first time. Her eyes were not kind or unkind. They were focused. I said that I had belongings inside, that I had slept there, that I contributed. Grant shook his head and smiled at the neighbors as if to say, "You see what I am dealing with." He added, "She is grown. She can figure it out." Ms. Caldwell wrote again. The whispering grew louder. I heard my name carried on breath I did not recognize. Someone across the street adjusted their phone angle. I felt small in a way that had nothing to do with height. Ms. Caldwell asked me to state my name and date of birth again for the record. I complied. She asked me if I consented to being removed from the premises. I said no. Grant exhaled through his nose and said, "We cannot have a scene." The officer's pen paused. She asked me for proof of residency one more time slower. I took a breath and reached back into my wallet to organize the cards I had fumbled. That was when the old ID caught on the edge of plastic and slid into view, faded, and scratched a relic I carried out of habit. Ms. Caldwell's pen stopped. She did not speak. She did not react. She looked at the card, and then at the clipboard, and then at the card again. The stillness pulled the air tight. Grant shifted his feet. My mother stepped forward and then stopped. I realized I was calm in a way that felt inappropriate to the moment, as if my body had decided this was a problem it understood. I had seen this kind of form before, I thought, in files I had processed in cases that turned on whether a single line had been filled correctly. Ms. Caldwell asked me to confirm my name once more. I did. She nodded and returned the cards to me, keeping the clipboard close. Do you believe a family can remove you with nothing but their voice if you do not have paperwork? I thought the old ID was just a memory until I saw her eyes stop on one line. 2 weeks earlier, my life still looked ordinary from the outside, which was the most unsettling part, because ordinary is where harm hides best. I woke up before dawn on weekdays and packed a lunch in a reused plastic container, rice and leftovers measured carefully, so I would not have to spend money I did not have. I worked part-time as a compliance assistant for a small logistics company on the east side of Harrisburg, the kind of job no one brags about, and no one notices until something goes wrong. I read regulations, highlighted sections. People skimmed and learned how often trouble came from pretending not to know. On my way home, I stopped at Wawa for a coffee I should not have bought and CVS for toothpaste, because it was on sale. The small rituals of staying afloat without asking anyone for help. When I got back to the house, Grant liked to comment on the timing as if it were evidence. Long day again, he would say. Smiling, rent is expensive, maybe you should be grateful you have a place to land. My mother would nod from the kitchen and add softly, Grant is trying, do not provoke him, as if peace were a switch I could flip by agreeing with everything. I paid what he called house money in cash because he insisted on it, small amounts folded carefully and handed over without ceremony. He never accepted transfers, never wanted anything documented, and when I asked once, he laughed and said it was simpler this way. Simpler for who was never discussed. I did not argue. I started doing more around the house to compensate, cleaning the bathroom twice a week, vacuuming, folding laundry that was not mine, cooking dinners I did not eat. Grant would inspect the work like a supervisor and find fault in details no one else would notice. Not good enough, he would say, pointing to a corner or a streak, then sigh as if burdened by my presence. My mother would watch and tell me quietly that I should not take it personally, that this was how households worked, that everyone had to pull their weight. It was a language of obligation that erased context. On Sundays we sat through church, and afterwards neighbors asked polite questions about work and weather. Grant joked about my finding myself phase, and people laughed because it sounded harmless. I smiled because smiling was cheaper than correcting them. At night I lay awake and counted weeks until my next paycheck, calculating groceries, bus fare, and a small cushion I was building in case I needed to leave quickly. I was not freeloading. I was preparing. There was a thin envelope in the back of my drawer that I checked sometimes without opening just to confirm it was still there. I did not tell anyone about it. I also checked my phone more often than usual, not because I was waiting for a message, but because I was tracking a calendar and inspection cycle I had learned to respect. Grant started changing the house in small ways, a new sink installed quickly, wiring adjusted behind walls, things that looked better without looking permitted. He was careful about appearances and careless about process. When I asked once if a permit was needed, he waved me off and said he knew what he was doing. My mother told me not to start trouble. Trouble came anyway, quietly. Grant began reminding me that I did not have a lease, that everything here was his, that generosity had limits. He asked for more cash one week, and when I handed it over, he tucked it into his pocket, and later told my mother I had not contributed. When I corrected him, he smiled and said, "Misunderstandings happen." Each day the ground shifted by inches. I understood then how people are pushed out without ever being told to leave, how residency becomes a story others tell, until it solidifies into truth. I started keeping notes in my head, dates, phrases, the way he framed things in front of others versus alone. I noticed how my mother avoided eye contact when he spoke for both of them. I kept going to work, kept saving, kept quiet. There were moments I almost left on my own terms, packed a bag and called a friend, but something held me back. Grant was in a hurry, and that mattered. He had deadlines and meetings, and an appraisal scheduled that he mentioned too often. I had planned to go before things exploded, but he chose to push me out on the worst possible day for him. By the time Grant started calling it concern, I understood that cruelty does not need raised voices to work. It only needs repetition and witnesses. The first layer was always delivered with a sigh, a soft dismissal that framed my reactions as the problem rather than his behavior. "You are too sensitive," he would say, leaning against the counter with a smile that suggested patience. My mother would glance up from the sink and add nothing, which made the sentence heavier because silence confirmed it. When I stopped responding to that, he moved to the second layer, the one that sounded like rules instead of judgment. In my house, we do not do excuses. The word excuses was flexible enough to cover fatigue scheduling conflicts or the simple fact that I disagreed. If I pointed out that I had worked late, he said work was not an excuse. If I mentioned that I paid cash every week, he said money was not the point. He spoke as if standards existed independently of context, as if authority were a natural law. My mother nodded along and reminded me that Grant was old-fashioned, that he believed in discipline, that it came from a good place. The third layer arrived when I stopped engaging altogether. I learned to listen and to nod and to store sentences the way people store receipts. Grant noticed my quiet and rebranded it as threat. "I am protecting your mother from your chaos," he said one evening while she sat at the table folding napkins that did not need folding. He looked at me like a problem that required containment. The word chaos was generous. My routines were predictable, my schedule boring. But chaos was useful because it justified intervention. My mother finally spoke and said he was only trying to keep the house calm, that I should appreciate his effort. It was the first time I felt the shape of the choice she was making. Calm over truth. Image over fairness. The fourth layer came when he realized the previous ones had trained the room. "I am changing the locks," he said casually one afternoon, as if discussing weather. "Not today, not yet, just letting me know what power looked like when spoken aloud." My mother protested weakly and then stopped when he reminded her of costs and timelines. I watched the way her shoulders dropped and understood that fear could be delegated. There were dinners where neighbors came over or people from church stopped by. Grant liked an audience. He poured drinks and laughed and told a story that always ended the same way. Noelle is in her finding herself phase. People smiled. Someone clinked a glass. My mother laughed too and touched his arm to keep things light. I smiled because refusing to would have made me the spectacle. I noticed which words he chose in public and which he saved for private, and how the public ones were worse because they taught others how to see me. After those dinners, I cleaned alone and replayed the phrases, filing them away. I was not reacting because reaction was what he expected. I was observing. I started noticing the house itself, the quiet evidence of shortcuts. New fixtures installed without paperwork taped inside cabinets. Electrical work that looked clean but felt rushed. A bathroom fan that vented into the attic instead of outside. Small things that add up when someone is trying to sell or refinance quickly. I did not say anything. I watched. I learned the pattern of his confidence and where it thinned. I learned that my mother would choose the version of events that allowed her to sleep. I learned that being reasonable could be a weapon. There were moments I felt my anger rise and then settle into something colder. I wrote nothing down. I kept it in my head, each sentence he used, especially the ones he delivered in front of others, because those were the ones that mattered later. When he told me I did not belong, he made sure someone else heard it. When he joked about my phase, he made sure laughter followed. It was training, and I was done being trained. Do you think favoritism is violence if it pushes a child out while calling it discipline? When I think about my father, I do not picture money or power or the kind of heroism people applaud. I picture paperwork stacked neatly and habits repeated until they became instinct. He worked as a county inspector for most of his adult life, a job that guaranteed he would be disliked by people who wanted shortcuts and tolerated by those who understood consequences. He was not charming about it. He showed up on time, asked for permits, checked measurements, and wrote notes in small, precise handwriting. People called him difficult. Contractors rolled their eyes when they saw his name on an inspection list. He did not care. At home, he kept his work ID long after it expired, tucked into the back of his wallet like a reminder rather than a credential. He kept copies of everything: tax forms, repair receipts, inspection notices, folded and labeled in envelopes that smelled faintly of paper and coffee. When I was young, he taught me small rules that sounded dull until they saved you. Always keep your documents. Never throw away a letter you did not understand. If something is not written down, it can be rewritten by someone else. He said it without drama, like advice about locking doors or turning off lights. He used to tell me that people do not respect you while you are alive. They respect the signature you leave behind. It was not bitterness, just observation, the kind that comes from watching authority work from the inside. On weekends, he took me with him sometimes when he had to check a site briefly, just to show me how things fit together. He pointed at wiring and asked me what looked wrong. He showed me where permits were posted and where they were missing. He talked about houses with histories that never quite went away, properties that changed hands without changing their problems. I remember him mentioning a place once years ago that kept resurfacing in complaints because renovations were done quietly and never closed out properly. He said work without permits does not disappear, it waits. Those words stayed with me. He died without leaving me anything that could be sold. There was no inheritance to argue over, no account to unlock. What he left was discipline. He left a way of seeing systems as maps rather than obstacles. When I started working as a compliance assistant, I realized how much of my thinking came from him. I could read a file and understand its story, see where something was missing, where a date did not align, where a note suggested unfinished business. I helped my boss sort cases and learned how offices remembered people longer than families did. I built a small network by being reliable, by returning calls, by knowing where to look. I did not advertise it. I just did the work. When things at home began to tighten, I thought of my father and the way he prepared quietly. I remembered how he kept his ID even when it no longer opened doors. It was not about access, it was about continuity. I remembered how he warned me that renovations without permits were not improvements, they were liabilities. I did not connect that memory to my own house at first. I just noticed details the way he taught me to. The uneven outlet cover, the fan venting wrong, the new sink installed too quickly. I kept my mouth shut because he also taught me that timing matters. You do not challenge someone while they think they are winning. You wait until the record speaks for you. I had no money from my father to protect me. I had something more uncomfortable, a piece of paper at the right moment. The morning he chose was not random, and that was the detail that made everything else click into place. Grant woke me earlier than usual with a knock that was too deliberate to be concern, already dressed as if he had somewhere important to be already rehearsed. He said we needed to talk and then did not wait for agreement. There was an appraisal scheduled that afternoon, and an inspection window open that week, words he dropped casually like weather updates, and suddenly the house had rules it had never enforced before. He told me he was taking the house back, as if it were a loan he had decided to recall. Said it was time for me to move on. Said adults had to handle things, and I would not understand. He did not want me in the way, and more importantly, he did not want me watching. He said he needed the place clean and quiet, said buyers and officials did not like complications, said I had made enough noise. I asked how long I had, and he said now with a smile that made it sound like mercy. My mother hovered behind him and said this was not personal, this was practical, as if practicality erased harm. Grant told me I could sleep at a friend's place, and added that people like me always had someone, a sentence that reduced my entire support system to a stereotype. When I reached for my jacket, he blocked the doorway and said it would just make things harder. Said he would bring it out later, said I was making a scene by insisting. He took my keys and told me I could pick things up another day, said it was better this way. He said all of this loudly enough for the porch to hear. Mrs. Haskins was watering her plants across the way and paused. Another neighbor slowed their car. Grant stepped outside first and motioned for me to follow like an usher guiding a late guest. I stood on the threshold and felt the ground shift from beneath me in inches. He said he was doing me a favor, said discipline was necessary, said this was what adults did when things got messy. When I asked why today, he looked away and said timing was timing, which told me everything. He was rushing. He wanted the house to present as uncomplicated. He wanted no witness inside who knew what had been changed without paperwork, no one who would notice what was new and what was missing. He wanted a clean narrative. He grabbed my arm when I hesitated and pulled me forward just enough to make it clear that consent was not required. The neighbors saw. A phone lifted. Someone pressed a doorbell across the street. Grant let go and straightened his shirt and told me to stand there while he finished something inside. My mother stayed just inside the door with her hand on the frame and said this would be over soon. I felt the heat rise and then settle into a cold clarity. He was not just removing me, he was clearing the scene. The house needed to look unoccupied by dissent. I thought about the sink installed too fast, the fan venting, wrong the wiring hidden behind fresh paint. I thought about the appraisal and the inspection window, and how those things did not like questions. I did not beg. I did not cry. I asked for my medication, and he said later. I asked for my shoes, and he said I would figure it out. He said it was my responsibility now. I looked at the steps and the bare ground, and felt the humiliation bloom in the open air, where everyone could see it. Grant leaned in and said quietly that this was for my own good, and that if I made trouble, he would call someone. He liked the sound of authority even when it was imaginary. I realized then that his confidence depended on speed, that he needed me gone before the afternoon before anyone with a clipboard asked the wrong question. That understanding steadied me. He was afraid. He did not say it, but his hurry did. When the county officer walked up the drive a few minutes later with a clipboard held like a shield, I felt the day pivot. Grant greeted her with the voice he used for professionals, calm and cooperative, already explaining how there had been a misunderstanding. I stood where he had left me and watched the performance unfold. Have you ever seen someone treat public humiliation as discipline? When the official stepped onto the porch, I understood that today was not the day I was thrown out. Today was the day someone was exposed. Ms. Caldwell took the cards from my hand, and the change happened without noise, which made it unmistakable. Her pen stopped mid-line. She did not clear her throat or look around. She simply held the old ID between her fingers and let the moment stretch while the porch watched. Grant kept talking, filling the silence with explanations about misunderstandings and timing, and how he was only trying to be helpful, but his words slid past her as if they had lost friction. She looked at the ID again, and then at me, measuring something that was not on the surface. Then she asked a question that cut through the performance with professional precision, asking if I was George Hartley's daughter. The air tightened. A phone across the street rose higher. Mrs. Haskins leaned forward and did not pretend this time. Grant's voice shifted instantly, smoothing itself into something careful and cooperative, saying, "Yes, that was my father, saying he had always respected the county, saying we were grateful for the work they did." Ms. Caldwell nodded once and handed my cards back, keeping the clipboard close. She asked Grant to step outside with her. The words were ordinary, but the effect was immediate. He hesitated just long enough for the neighbors to notice, then complied, adjusting his jacket, as if to regain authority through posture. They moved a few steps down the porch, close enough that fragments carried. Permit, inspection, violation. Someone whispered the words aloud like captions. My mother stood frozen in the doorway, hands at her sides, unable to smooth this over because smoothing required denial, and denial had run out of space. Ms. Caldwell spoke in a low voice that carried anyway, asking about recent work, asking where the permits were posted, asking why a follow-up note from years earlier had never been closed. Grant laughed once and said there must be a mistake, said paperwork was confusing, said he had been meaning to address it. She listened without interruption and then flipped the clipboard to a page I recognized by the way the header sat. She pointed to a line and said the file had a note attached from years back instructing the office not to close it. "Do not close file." The phrase landed like a gavel. I felt a small, steady confirmation rather than surprise. I had expected a reaction. I had not expected mercy. Ms. Caldwell asked Grant again to step further outside so they could talk privately, and this time it was not a request. He complied, the confidence draining from his shoulders as the porch became a stage he no longer controlled. A neighbor's doorbell chimed again. My mother took a step forward and then stopped, finally seeing that stepping out would mean choosing a side she had avoided choosing for years. Mrs. Caldwell turned back to me and asked if I had anywhere safe to stand while she completed the review. Her tone was different now, not sympathetic, just correct. I nodded and remained where I was, refusing the role of spectacle. Grant tried to interject, saying this was a family matter, saying it did not need to escalate, saying we could handle it inside. Mrs. Caldwell replied that once a compliance issue was identified, it was no longer private. The word compliance carried weight. It always did. She asked about the sink, the fan, the wiring, the timeline. Grant answered quickly and vaguely, the way people do when they hope speed will substitute for facts. Ms. Caldwell wrote, she asked for documentation. He did not have it. She asked why the work had been done before appraisal. He said renovations improved value. She said unpermitted work delayed transactions. A neighbor murmured agreement. My mother closed her eyes. I stood still and watched authority rearrange itself around evidence rather than volume. I understood then what my father meant about signatures. You could be dismissed your entire life and still have the record speak for you when it mattered. Ms. Caldwell informed Grant that the review would continue and that certain changes would need to be addressed before any sale or refinance could proceed. She explained the next steps with clarity, dates, notices, requirements. Grant nodded too often. When she finished, she looked at me again and said she would note that I had been present at the start of the interaction. Presence mattered. Across the street, someone lowered their phone. The porch exhaled. My mother remained in place, unable to unsee what had just happened. Ms. Caldwell thanked everyone for their cooperation and said she would be in touch. Grant smiled tightly and said, "Of course, we appreciate it." I saw his hand shake when he reached for the doorknob. You have to choose sometimes between family and truth when truth makes family look bad. Grant forced a grin as the neighbors dispersed, but his fingers would not stop trembling, and I knew this was only the beginning. After Ms. Caldwell left, the street did not return to normal. It slowed first, as if everyone needed time to decide what they had just witnessed. And then it sped up in directions Grant could not control. The county sent a formal notice within days, and the language was neutral and firm, opening a compliance review and listing items that required documentation. The appraisal was postponed without a new date, a quiet delay that spoke louder than cancellation. Grant spent hours at the dining table sorting papers he had never cared about before calling contractors who did not answer printing forms he did not understand. He asked my mother to help, and she did moving stacks from one side to the other, trying to make order where there was none. I watched from a distance and felt something unfamiliar, not triumph, not relief, just a lightness where pressure had been. The review required timelines and permits and proof that did not exist, and each request narrowed his options. The sink had been installed before approval. The fan vented incorrectly. The wiring changes were undocumented. Each line item was small on its own and devastating together. The house became a file, and the file did not care about excuses. The HOA group chat lit up with polite curiosity that quickly turned into speculation. Did you hear there was an inspection? Someone said the sale was delayed. Someone else asked if the renovations were approved. At church, people smiled too carefully and asked Grant how things were going the way people do when they already know the answer. At the potluck, a woman mentioned permits as if she were discussing recipes. The neighborhood learned a new vocabulary and used it often. Grant tried to project calm and failed in increments. He snapped at my mother over printer ink. He accused me of bringing trouble without saying my name. He stayed up late filling forms and woke early to make calls that went nowhere. The county requested a packet and a deadline. The deadline passed. Another notice followed. Each step increased the cost of delay. I felt none of the satisfaction people imagine revenge brings. What I felt was clarity. Systems do not punish out of spite, they proceed. My mother asked me one evening what I wanted, and the question startled her because it assumed choice. I looked at her and saw calculation in her eyes. Not malice, just survival. I understood then that she would choose the side that promised stability, even if stability was temporary. The street chose its own side. Neighbors waved less. Conversations shifted when Grant entered a room. Authority had changed the temperature, and everyone adjusted. I received a short call one afternoon while I sat at the library table, printing documents for work, a calm voice that knew the process and asked one precise question. I answered, and the call ended. It was enough to remind me that I was not alone, that quiet networks exist for people who do their jobs well. The review continued. The appraisal remained on hold. The closing did not happen. Grant moved closer to a breaking point, and I stayed still, watching cause meet consequence without commentary. Do you believe following the law is sometimes the only way to survive a toxic family? I did not confront Grant or announce anything, or take satisfaction in watching him struggle, because none of that would have changed the outcome, and all of it would have fed the story he preferred to tell. What I did instead was slow down and pay attention, the way my father taught me, the way my job required. I gathered what was already around me and treated it with respect. Receipts from the hardware store that had been shoved into drawers, instruction manuals left on counters, letters from the county that had been opened and ignored, photos I had taken casually on my phone before and after small repairs, meant at the time to remember paint colors or fixture models, now useful because they showed timelines. I did not alter anything. I did not embellish. I let the facts remain themselves. In the evenings, I walked to the library because it was quiet and predictable and smelled like old books and dust, and I sat at a wooden table where generations of people had come to make sense of paper. I printed what I needed, one page at a time, careful with margins, careful with dates. I labeled folders with plain language and placed documents in the order the forms preferred. I did not rush. I did not brag. When something was missing, I noted that it was missing and moved on. There is power in acknowledging gaps without trying to fill them with guesses. I submitted requests through the right channels, using the process designed for people who did not have leverage. Right to know is not dramatic. It is quiet and patient, and it works when you let it. I mailed what needed mailing and kept copies of what I sent. I learned which offices preferred email and which required paper. I waited for responses and logged them when they came. All of it was ordinary. All of it was decisive. I thought about the number of times I had watched older clients panic and offer explanations when silence would have served them better, and I did not repeat their mistakes. I did not need to invent anything. The system already knew enough. In between tasks, I checked my savings and felt steady. I had planned for months without telling anyone, because plans invite interference. It was not a fortune. It was a cushion enough to live simply for a while, enough to say no without fear. Grant assumed desperation, because desperation made his story work. I did not correct him. I let him underestimate me. When responses arrived, they were precise and limited, confirming what was already apparent. Documents existed or they did not. Dates aligned or they did not. The mirror was placed and I stepped back. There is a lesson older people understand that younger ones often learn late: that paper outlives noise. I did not seek applause or revenge. I sought accuracy. The more accurate the record became, the less room there was for anyone to rewrite me. Have you ever kept a secret just to protect yourself? He found me where life is most ordinary, because ordinary places make audacity feel reasonable. I was loading a small bag into my car in the CVS parking lot when he stepped out from between vehicles and said my name like we were meeting by accident. His face had practiced a new expression, softer around the edges, apologetic enough to invite conversation. He said he had overreacted, and that stress made people do things they regretted. He spoke quickly, as if speed could outrun memory. He said family was complicated and that we all made mistakes. I listened without interrupting, because interruptions give people room to adjust. He asked how I was doing and said he was worried about me. Then he reached the point. He needed help with a form, just a signature to clarify something, just a temporary consent to move a process along. He said it would make everything easier, and that once it was over, we could put this behind us. I told him I was busy. He smiled and said it would only take a minute. My phone rang, and it was my mother, right on time, her voice careful and tired, saying she hoped I would do the right thing so this could be over. She said she was embarrassed at church and that people were talking. She said helping would calm things down. I understood then that calm was still the goal, even if it required erasing me again. Grant held out the paper like a peace offering. I looked at it and saw my name positioned where power transferred quietly. I handed it back and said no. He frowned and tried a different angle. Said he had always tried to teach me responsibility. Said this was my chance to show maturity. I told him I would not sign anything. His voice hardened for a second and then softened again, switching masks. He said he had taken me in and that I owed him. I said nothing until the sentence formed cleanly. You did not drag me out because you were angry. You dragged me out because you thought I was powerless. The words landed and stayed. He stepped back and laughed once without humor and said I was being dramatic. I got into my car and drove away. The review concluded without theatrics. Fines were assessed. Remediation was required. Timelines extended. The deal collapsed under its own paperwork. Grant lost control of the finances he had built his authority on. My mother faced the quiet consequences she had avoided whispers and looks and questions she could not redirect. The house was no longer a story she could manage. I kept living my life at a smaller scale with steadier ground. Life settled into a quieter pattern once the noise stopped chasing me. I moved into a small place with a door that locked and windows that faced a parking lot instead of a stage. I kept my routine simple and my expectations smaller, and that made room for something gentler to arrive. The relief did not feel like victory. It felt like sleep after a long vigil. I cooked for myself and walked in the evenings, and noticed how my shoulders lowered when no one was measuring me. The ending everyone expects did not come in a lump sum or a dramatic reveal. It arrived the way prepared things arrive on schedule. I had accepted a full-time offer weeks before the day Grant pulled me onto the porch. I had not shared it because sharing invited sabotage. I had learned that lesson early. The offer came from a team that valued compliance not because it sounded impressive, but because it kept operations alive. I had a mentor who understood the system the way my father did not, powerful, just precise, someone who taught me when to speak and when to file. I did not win because I was richer or louder or luckier. I won because I kept records and waited and chose not to argue with people who needed me small. The quiet after mattered most. I visited my father's grave and told him thank you for the habits that saved me. I understood then what safety meant. When you are young, you learn that family is where you are held. At my age, I learned that safety is sometimes a lock and a piece of paper in the right place. What do you think is blood a reason to endure forever?